Hi, my name's Tim Claptor, and I'm the Online Learning Technology Leader in UImagine at Charles State University. In this think piece, I wanted to talk about a distributed learning system, a way of rethinking and reframing how we do online learning. In previous think pieces, I've discussed the idea of networks and the need to move beyond the default. So today I wanted to bring those two themes together to discuss a topic relevant to most of us: online learning. Over the last decade, the LMS has become synonymous with online learning. The LMS has become the default. To many, it defines what online learning looks like, what it's possible, and what its limitations are. But is that really all there is? I'd suggest that the LMS, the default, acts as a container for our thinking. Just like a vessel does with liquid, it shapes the contents. It shapes the performance and what we can imagine is possible. The container provides hard edges, limitations which define how and what we think and do. For me, the LMS acts a little bit like Procustis for online learning, cutting off our legs in order to fit its shape and mould. And the reason it does this is the way that it was designed, built and organised. It's a centralised system, and it creates a walled garden, its own ecosystem. So rather than being of the web, it attempts to create its own. It's an attempt to shape and deliver an online experience in a very specific way. It's for that very reason that a key trait of the LMS is a lack of user autonomy and agency. Teachers and students lack any real ability to self-govern or an ability to act on their own. An element of control is baked into a centralised system. It's one of its distinct features, but it has some significant side effects. One is an embedded power dynamic that prioritises institutional needs over students, which often reinforces didactic teaching methods where teaching is delivered from a central point. The other is the Panopticon effect. From a central space, all can be observed, monitored, and tracked. This surveillance is often marketed as analytics, and while it may indeed be able to offer some meaningful data, it does so at the expense of dialogue, and perhaps more importantly, permission. What has happened in the online learning space is similar to what happens in any new media. Initially, it tends to copy the old, but over time it develops its own distinct form and function. When film came along, it replicated the theatre. But over time it developed its own distinct set of features. Radio did the same, adapting the theatre, film, and news before something like Orwell's War of the Worlds came along to demonstrate something truly unique to pure radio. Early television replicated radio too, in many cases simply broadcasting radio and theatre recordings. But over time, TV developed its own form. Online learning is yet to go through that phase. There are examples of the fringes, Downes, Siemens and Cormier's work on connectivist and rhizomatic learning, for example. But for the most part, online learning is still an attempt to replicate the physical classroom in the medium of the web. The fact that the biggest LMS company is called Blackboard is not a coincidence. The fact that we are still basing our models and content on the linear nature of books is no coincidence. This is how we tend to work with what's new. We bring along the old, transplant them in the new. Usually over time they begin to fade away. But at the moment we are constrained in many ways by this inertia. Online learning tends to capture the baseline functions of the classroom, but often its most unappealing components. It does little to capture or enable the social functions, nor the spaces outside of the classroom where learning tends to actually happen. Where are the corridors, the coffee shops or bars? Online learning tends to consist of linear tasks, navigating information and working through content. It's not done as an exploration of hypertext documents, but as a series of next buttons. And this creates what I've called learning on rails, similar to the style of video games where you are immersed in a realistic environment, but have no free movement to explore, simply to complete each task one after the other. Centralised systems also enforce arbitrary time boxes, which have a profound impact on learning. Access tends to be limited to a session, so 6 months, and then students are locked out. Despite the fact that they paid for the learning that occurred there, students no longer have access to the modules, discussions, wikis, or content that lives within the LMS. This time boxing effectively forces students to start from scratch every session, their profiles, their identity, and their network. It's the equivalent of Facebook deleting all your friends and posts every 6 months. To that end, I'd suggest we've reached peak LMS. It has achieved saturation in the market, and in doing so reduced differentiation in online offerings. We are all beholden to innovation being provided to us by vendors. The return for having an LMS will begin to diminish. Instead of being of value, it starts to be a hindrance. If our goal is to create a distinctive curricula and learning experience, then I think we need to start exploring what else is out there. To move beyond the current expectations of online learning, to move beyond the LMS, we need to understand the medium, and that's the web. The last 25 years have been an experiment, finding out simply what's possible with a globally connected and distributed network. We've seen what works, what doesn't. We've seen what we should do and what we shouldn't. So what if we took those ideas today and started to imagine what is possible? The internet is a distributed system. Its success comes from that underlying infrastructure, one that is shared and opened. Designed to be more resilient to breakdowns and less vulnerable to attack, it also acts to distribute power, so it is less abused and better reflects needs of all stakeholders, especially the small and weak. It's for this reason that the internet has become a place where emergence happens, fostering more innovation and discovery because people are empowered to do so. They have autonomy and they have agency within this kind of a structure, and the ability to carve out and create their own personal and virtual spaces to share. So what if the learning environment looked like that? Back in 2012, a small revolution happened at a university in Virginia. They deployed the first domain of one's own system at their university. Domain of one's own provided every student and staff member with their own domain and web server. Each user could deploy their own applications, run their own websites, create portfolios, and conduct and publish their own research projects. They had deployed the infrastructure that allowed the web to be part of the institution, rather than something that had to be walled out. This was a hugely revolutionary concept, but one that served many purposes. It promoted and provided the platform to develop digital literacies, created new opportunities, spaces to explore, possibilities that could now be imagined, because there was a sense of freedom. Domains have begun to appear across many institutions now, all around the world. Domain of one's own challenges the centralized model of the LMS. It offered a new model for working, learning, and teaching in the online medium. At the moment, domain of one's own relies on co-opting open source applications into education. Blogging tools like WordPress have become powerful tools in the hands of skilled artisans. But what if we use the infrastructure of domain of one's own to develop tools specifically for learning? What if we utilize the latest technologies and the open nature of the web and software to create new possibilities? And that's my idea behind a distributed learning system, a way of structuring a set of existing tools and creating deep links between them to create an alternative to the LMS. Something that's built around the autonomy and agency that domain of one's own provides, with the organizational tools and integrations to support institutions. The key to this model is something that is still quite new to many of us: APIs. Application programming interfaces provide a way for different systems and applications to interact with each other. They can share data, send messages to each other, and trigger routines to provide different inputs and outputs. APIs are how apps talk to each other. Services like If allow you to integrate APIs to create your own workflows, which are based around a simple workflow of if this, then that. In this way, I can get different services and different applications, even different devices to perform tasks. I can get my phone that senses my geolocation when I get on campus and log an entry in a spreadsheet program, the time that I arrived. It triggers again when I leave, and so now I've built my own automated timesheet. APIs are how we can get the web to talk to each other, and how we can build a viable distributed system. We create a framework for them to talk to each other. In this system, each student and staff member would have their own copy of a system on their server, a node. Nodes would act as their own entity. They would act as federated points, able to act autonomously, but allow for connections to be made. And nodes would connect to hubs, and these would represent subjects or courses, but much more flexible than that. They could be set up for projects, research, committees, and collaboration. Hubs define relationships between nodes. They allow an agreed set of rules to be developed and define the nature of the relationship, what data will be shared, who with, and for how long. So if we think about a typical subject, a teacher would create a new hub at an institutional level. At this point, they would be able to set up the parameters for the hub, what content might be, the methods for communication, what various tool configurations are needed. They then can connect their own node to the hub, At that point, the distributed learning system would provide a handshake, a way of verifying and agreeing to the relationship. It would provide a way for setting security and privacy settings, as well as which tools might be utilised at the node level. Once that's done, the hub would send invitations to students that can be enrolled. Each student would follow the same handshake method, and they would now have their own instance of the subject running on their node. Students and teachers would interact with their own node. Messages from the hub could be displayed, communication sent back and forth, content would be federated so that students could read, annotate, and interact with their materials that would remain with them forever. All the tools we currently use for learning would all still work, but in a way that is shaped by the student, and with them having access and choice. Ownership is now built into the model. The real potential of the distributed learning system is development of new applications and tools. For instance, what if we use the web to create assessments based on discovery, exploration, and reflection on learning? We could do that more easily and with less ethical challenges if students manage this themselves. We could create a Pathfinder app that could map a student's learning on the web. Students would place markers where they made discoveries, meaning, and explored, and from this develop maps of their learning. Rather than only assess the essay, their ability to synthesize information, what if we could actually see that against their map? How did they get there? Rather than punitive approaches to plagiarism, we create a way for students to actually demonstrate their process, to make the learning visible. And this is just one possibility, and I'm excited to hear what other people might think is possible. This think piece is really just a first step to actually redefining the system that supports and shapes online learning. Rather than just poo-pooing the LMS, I think we need to actually have a viable alternative. And having spent a couple of years in this space, I think we've got one. The most interesting aspect to all this is what comes next. What happens when you rethink, redefine, and change the underlying paradigm. To me, we are on the cusp of needing to make some significant changes in how we think about online learning. We need to actually start to respond to the medium and using its potential, rather than simply attempting to recreate the classroom. The possibilities here would enable CSU to create a truly distinctive curricula and learning experience, one that I think would produce the kind of graduates that would thrive in the future. A distributed learning system radically changes the possibilities and provides a way to really develop self-directed learners, providing students with a level of autonomy and agency that is simply not possible within the LMS and other centralized systems. They will develop the skills to manage and define their own learning in a lifelong way.